Make Buffy concepts for every brawler. Starting off with Brock. For his first gadget, I reworked it so now instead of one big missile, Brock will now shoot two normal ones, which when combined will now have the ability to destroy walls. Then for the Buffy, I made the explosion radius 50% larger. For his second gadget, I reworked rocket laces so it can now be aimed and will slow enemies. Then for the Buffy, I made it so rocket laces will now detonate twice, but the second explosion won't propel Brock, meaning when he lands, there'll be another explosion. With more rockets equipped, all rockets from Brock's super will now have a 50% chance to have a secondary explosion that deals half damage. Brock will now reload 33% faster to account for the extra bullet. Then, for Brock's hypercharge Buffy, I made it so his main attacks can now clear walls, and the explosion radius is also 25% larger. Now it's time for Bull. I started off with reworking Stomper, again, so now no longer require Bull's super to use. This should make it more versatile. Then, for the Buffy, Stomper will now give Bull a 15% damage buff for 3 seconds. For his second gadget, Bull will now get a 13% speed buff for 3 seconds, and any extra health will be converted into a decaying shield. Berserker will now cause the enemy who hit Bull below 60% health to take 15% more damage from Bull's attacks for 5 seconds. Tough Guy will now knock back enemies when activated and slow them for 0.5 seconds. Then, while hypercharged, when Bull attacks, his movement speed will increase by 20% for 1 second. Now it's time for El Primo. Asteroid Belt will now stun enemies it hits for 1 second. El Primo will now throw enemies with significantly more force, decreasing their flight time and grounding them for 1 second when they land. Enemies El Primo sets on fire will now leave a trail of fire behind them that lasts for 1 second. If they run back on it, their burn duration will reset. If El Primo hits an ally with his super, they'll also receive a short speed boost. While hypercharged, El Primo will unload his attacks twice as fast and attack in a 10% wider cone shape. Now it's time for Poco. Tuning Fork will now give Poco and allies a 13% movement speed buff for its duration. Protective Tunes will now give Poco and allies an 100% super charge rate buff for 4 seconds. Poco's first star power will now allow him to charge his super from healing at 1/3 of his normal rate. Poco's music will now get stuck in enemies' heads, causing them to be unable to passively regenerate health for 9 seconds. While hypercharged, Poco will now fire 2 rounds with each attack, but the second round will only charge his super at a rate of 50%. Barley's Sticky Syrup Mixer will now prevent passive healing of enemies who are in its area. Herbal Tonic will now give Barley and allies a 15% movement speed buff. Barley's main attack will now deal an additional 100 damage exactly 1 second after it lands. Medical Use will now scale its healing with the health of the enemy Barley hits. Then, while Barley is hypercharged, his main attack will give him back half an ammo for each enemy he hits. When Nita uses Sulfur, Bruce will now become immune to all damage for 1 second, and any damage he takes during that time will become a decaying shield. Bear Paws will now send a second shockwave onto the ground around Nita. This shockwave will also deal 1500 damage and be able to stun enemies. When healing from Bear with me, Nita and Bruce will now share it with nearby allies. Bruce will now unlock a super attack, where every 4 attacks he will deal extra damage and slow enemies. Then, while Nita is hypercharged, her attacks will become twice as wide. Rosa's Unfriendly Bushes will now have double the slow strength and duration. Grow Light will now also restore destroyed bushes as long as they are within a 5x5 area. Rosa's Thorny Gloves will now reduce enemies' reload speed, supercharge rate, and movement speed while active. While in bushes, all healing Rosa receives will be amplified by 40%. Then, while Rosa is hypercharged, her attacks will be able to send shockwaves through nearby bushes, which will increase her range by 75% and increase her damage by 25%. Before I continue, don't forget to leave your Buffy ideas down below in the comments. Rico's Bouncy Castle gadget will now receive a slight rework. Instead of now healing for each projectile that hits Rico, it will now have a lifesteal that will heal Rico for 256 health for each bullet that hits an enemy. This healing rate would also scale if he has the super bouncy star power. Then, for the Buffy, if a bullet hits an enemy on its way back, it will duplicate itself, allowing Rico to get even more healing. Multi-ball launcher will now give Rico a 2% speed boost for 3 seconds that scales with each projectile that he lands. Rico will now start to recover health 30% quicker. Rico's bullets now no longer have a limit to the number of bounces, meaning the 256 damage can stack infinitely, or until it runs out of range. Then, while Rico is hypercharged, his projectiles will not stop bouncing, even off of enemies. For Jessie, I started off with reworking their gadget Recoil Spin, to now instead increase their projectile speed by 50% for 5 seconds. Then for the Buffie, I made it so it also affect the unload speed. Spark Plug will now stun enemies for half a second before the slow takes effect. When using Energize, Jessie will temporarily buff the range, damage, and fire rate of Scrappy by 15% when zapping it at max health. Scrappy's energy orbs can now hit the same brawler more than once if it hits one of their allies first. While hypercharged, Jessie's projectiles will now travel 50% faster and will bounce between the same enemies multiple times. For 8-Bit, I started off by reworking his teleport gadget, so now I have an increased cooldown but knock back enemies. Then for the Buffie, I made it so when using it, 8-Bit would recover 20% of his max health. Next, I gave Cheat Cartridge a quick buff, so now it will only take 33% longer than our normal attack to unload. Then for the Buffie, I gave each bullet a small lifesteal. While plugged in, 8-Bit will now heal 1000 health per second, and allies will get a 10% movement speed buff. 8-Bit's damage booster will now give him and allies a 15% reload speed buff. 8-Bit found his player 1 gun. While hypercharged, he'll now fire 2 sets of bullets. Daryl's tar barrels will now be able to ground enemies if they are slowed for 2.5 seconds. Daryl will now spin so fast that he'll knock back all enemies. If Daryl is under 50% health, the shield strength will be increased to 35%. After supering, Daryl will now instantly reload all his ammo and then get the buff. Then, while hypercharged, every single one of Daryl's attacks will now charge his super, providing he hits every projectile. For Dynamite, I started off by reworking Satchel Charge, so now each Dynamite stick will do half of the stun duration. Then for the Buffie, I made it so each stick of Dynamite will have a 20% larger area. Each stick of Dynamite will now slow enemies for half a second and this stacks. Dyna Jump will now push Dynamite even further and give him a 10% speed boost when he lands. Dynamite's super now has even more range. Dynamite's attacks now leave a burning area on the ground for 2 seconds that deals 480 damage. This will not have damage over time, but this area will slow enemies. When destroyed, Salty Barrel will now knock back enemies, and Penny can now tap her gadget button early to instantly destroy it, dealing 1000 damage. All of Penny's attacks fired during a 1.5 second duration will also trigger a cannon blast. Upon being placed, Penny's cannon will now explode twice with a second larger shockwave that deals 50% damage. The coins from Penny's attacks will now linger on the ground for 1 second. If an enemy steps on them, they will take 500 damage. While hypercharged, if enemies manage to dodge a cannonball shot, Penny will become enraged, dealing 75% more damage to them for 1 second. Last Hurrah will now also slow enemies for half a second. Mind Mania Mines will now linger on the ground 33% longer. Say that one 3 times fast. All healing Tick receives is 15% stronger, well below 40% health. Tick's movement speed is also 20% faster, well below 50% health. Tick's attacks gain a 4th mind and a 4th ammo while he's hypercharged. Heat Ejector will now linger on the ground for 1 more second. Flying Hook will now travel 10% further and grant Carl immunity while traveling. After his super duration ends, if Carl is below 35% health, then he will keep the shield for an additional 3 seconds. If Carl's pickaxe hits a wall, it will return 20% faster. Carl's attacks will now leave a fire trail that deals damage over time at 25% the damage of the hypercharge. Jackie will instantly start to passively regen at 40% of the normal rates. Jackie will now make 1 block that she rebuilt permanently unbreakable. Counter Crush will now slow enemies' movement speed and reload speed for half a second. Thrown attacks will now deal 40% less damage if directly over top of Jackie. Jackie's attacks will now slow enemies for half a second and unload 80% quicker while hypercharged. For Gus, I started off by reworking Soul Switcher, so now instead of it making the next attack summon a spirit, it will make all of Gus's attacks for the next 2 seconds spawn a spirit, but he will now lose 25% of his max health when activating the gadget. Then, For the Buffie, I made it so all Spirit's claims abilities active will now charge Gus's super. Cookie Popper will now steal 35% of its damage dealt to give Gus the decaying shield. Spirit Animal will now instantly reload all ammo on Gus or whoever uses Spooky's power. Spirits will now instantly initiate passive regeneration whenever they are collected. While hypercharged, all of Gus's attacks will leave a spirit, and spirits will now slow nearby enemies. Bo's super totem now has triple the health, but the same lifetime. It'll also only decay while Bo or an ally is in its radius. Bo's mines explode with a 15% larger area and slow enemies caught during its delay. Bo's mines now pull enemies to the center of the explosion. If the enemies are caught by more than one mine, they'll be grounded for half a second. Enemies caught in Circling Eagle will now leave footsteps behind them for half a second after leaving Bo's vision. While hypercharged, each of Bo's attacks will now leave a single mine on the ground that explodes after a half-second delay with a 50% radius. Homemade Recipe can now go through one layer of walls, but will lose its homing effect to do so. Auto Aimer will now slow enemies for half a second and have Splash. When Piper hits an opponent with her attack, she'll gain a short speed boost for half a second. When active, Ambush will now make Piper's shots invisible for the first 20% of their flight path. While hypercharged, Piper's attacks will charge 3 times as fast. This allows her to take down much closer enemies. For Pam, I started off by reworking Scrap Sucker to no longer steal ammo. But because of this, it will now have a shorter cooldown. Then, for the Buffie, allies within Pam's Mama's Hug radius will now also receive their own share of this ammo. Pam will now also emit a healing pulse from where she's standing. This will stack with the super. Mama's Hug now has a 70% larger area and has a second wave that heals at a rate of 30%. Mama's Squeeze will now deal damage in a space 33% larger than the healing turret's area. While hypercharged, Pam's attacks will now charge an overshield, and for every 800 damage it charges, she'll knock back enemies. Vitamin Booster now gives BB a 12% speed boost. Extra Sticky is now 50% stickier and will leave a trail of stickiness on the ground. BB's reload speed is now increased by 20% while her home run bar is charged. All unfriendly effects lose 20% of their duration and 33% of their effectiveness. While hypercharged, all of BB's attacks will be fully charged. If an enemy is hit into a wall, they'll take double the damage. Honey Molasses will now leech ammo from enemies, causing them to lose a third of an ammo every second. Rattled Hive will now deal more damage the closer the enemies are to B. B's Big Stain will now slow enemies for half a second if she didn't miss her prior shot. Honeycomb will now continue to protect B for an additional second after attacking. While hypercharged, B's projectiles will move twice as fast. Enemies flung by Twister will now drop a third of their ammo, with each full ammo adding a 500 damage projectile to the Twister. Gale's Gadget button will now allow him to rotate Spray Ejector after its placement. The rotation cooldown is 5 seconds, but he can place 2 of them now. Bustery Blow will now stun enemies regardless if they hit a wall or not. Freezing Snow can now accumulate over time, similar to Lose Brain Freeze, taking 5 attacks or 15 projectiles. While hypercharged, Gale's attacks will gain 2 more projectiles, and each attack will increase his movement speed by 13%. Return to Sender now waits for the next attack to hit Nanny, but after 2 seconds the split will become 50-50. Warping Time will now recover 1000 missing health. Every 1500 damage Nanny takes while supering, Peep will send out a shockwave that deals 1500 damage. Peep will now leave an area of fire on the ground where it explodes, dealing 480 damage a second. While hypercharged, Nanny's projectiles will also grow as they travel, and explode. Gotcha now allows Colette to heal past her max health through a decaying shield. Nuh-uh will now grant Colette aim assist on her next shot. Every enemy hit by Colette's super will also increase shield duration for 1 second. If an enemy is pushed into a wall, they will take an additional tick of damage equivalent to the super. Colette's Spirit will now also follow her attacks, but only to 60% of range. Edgar's shield will now fully recover if he defeats an enemy. Edgar will self-heal at 152% the normal rate while this is active. When below 40% health, Edgar's self-healing will be boosted by 30%. Edgar's Crash Landing now causes the ground to rumble, dealing an additional 200 damage a second for 5 seconds. While hypercharged, Edgar's attacks will now cover a 360-degree radius with a third projectile that deals 35% damage. Breakthrough will now charge super and give Stu a speed boost for 1 second. Speed Zone will now only decay if an enemy is in its range. Stu's super will now travel instantly and he can save up a second charge. Gasso Heal will now heal Stu for 15% of the damage Nitro Boost does. Stu will now fire additional shots in a Y shape. Shots will also travel significantly faster. Nest Egg will now recharge 5 seconds of its gadget cooldown for each enemy hit by its explosion. Reverse Polarity will now gain strength for each bounce it does. Grounded will now partially block enemy attacks, reducing their range by 50%. Positive Feedback now gains strength for each of Bill's subsequent hits, up to an additional 30%. While hypercharged, Bill can have infinite orbs bouncing. However, each additional orb is 50% weaker than the previous. If Orb 2 would despawn, then Orb 3 would gain strength, and so on. Radio Check now throws 3 attacks, but they each have a 30-degree offset of the previous one. Watchtower gives Grom and allies some elite comms, increasing the range of friendlies by 12%. Grom will now also gain movement speed by hitting enemies with his attacks. X Factor will now slow enemies hit by the edge of its radius. While hypercharged, Grom's attacks will now also explode in an X radius. Coin Shower now has the same projectile count, but coins move 33% faster. Then, for the Buffy, Coin Shower will now slow enemies for 1 second. Piggy Bank now leaves fire on the ground around its explosion area. Keep the Change will now give Griff a supercharge rate buff for 1 second after he lands 3 shots. When out of combat for 2 seconds, Griff will regain 25% of his missing health. Griff's projectile speed is massively increased while hypercharged. Ron Banana will now reduce Ash's health by 10%, but double his rage shot rate for 3 seconds. Then for the Buffy, Ash's attacks will now recover 0.4 ammo or 0.6 cap if they hit an enemy. Chill Pill will now give Ash a 15% speed buff for 3 seconds. First Bash now makes the end of Ash's attack explode. Mad as Heck now increases Ash's supercharge rate by up to 20% depending on how enraged she's become. While hypercharged, all of Ash's attacks will now spawn rats. Stunt Double will now instantly trigger passive regeneration on Lola and give her and her ego a 10% speed boost. Freeze Frame will now have a significantly longer cooldown, but give Lola and her ego immunity to all enemy attacks for 1 second. Then Lola and her ego will receive the 40% shield. Then for the Buffy, Freeze Frame will now reload 2 ammo. Improvise will now slow enemies for half a second. Projectiles from Lola's ego will now heal Lola for 50% of the damage they deal. Then, for the Buffy, Lola's healing from her ego will now splash in a 1.5 tile radius around her, healing at 50% rate. While hypercharged, Lola and her ego will deal max damage, and her ego will passively heal. For Bonnie, I started off by reworking Crash Test to now heal Bonnie for all damage it does, but the cooldown will go from 10 to 15 seconds. Then for the Buffy, Crash Test will now travel 50% further. Sugar Rush will now also increase Bonnie's supercharge rate by 20%. Black Powder will now also increase Bonnie's flight speed. Wisdom Tooth now explodes on impact, but dealing 25% extra damage in a circle instead of an X shape. While hypercharged, Clyde will gain an 100% supercharge rate boost and reload 50% faster, and then while hypercharged, Bonnie will gain a 4th projectile and move 15% faster after attacking. Magnetic Field will now steal 33% of all opponent ammo, reloading Sam up to 1.5. Pulse Repellent will now stun enemies caught by it for half a second. Hardy Recovery will now ground enemies caught by Sam recalling his Knuckle Busters. Remote Recharge will now slow nearby enemies. While hypercharged, Sam's attack is now always full strength. Caramelize will now taunt enemies, causing them to follow Mandy. After they travel 1 tile, the taunt will end and they'll become slowed for 2.5 seconds. Cookie Crumbs now explodes on impact, dealing 33% more damage in a 2 tile area. Mandy's shots now deal up to 15% more damage the farther they travel. Hard Candy will knock back enemies every second shot Mandy lands. Mandy's attacks fire significantly faster while hypercharged. Finish Them now gives Maisie a movement speed buff for 2 seconds. Disengage now stuns enemies for 50% longer duration. Maisie's attacks now become the 20% wider the further they travel. Tremors now scares enemies, causing them to run directly away while being slowed. Maisie's attacks are always at max speed and travel 1 tile further while hypercharged. Rework. Hank will now gain 40% of his current health as a decaying shield that knocks back enemies. Then for the Buffy, while the shield is active, 30% of all damage Hank does will be added to it. Another rework. Hank's next Balloon Blast will slow enemies for up to 4 seconds depending on its charge. Then for the Buffie, water balloons will now slow enemies 50% more effectively. Hank now keeps the shield for 2.5 seconds after departing from a wall. Rework. Hank's balloons now give him an additional 10% movement speed once the attack charges past 80%. Then for the Buffie, Hank will get a permanent movement speed boost from medium to fast. While hypercharged, Hank's balloon blast will charge 3 times as fast. For Pearl, we're going to start off with the rework. Made with Love will heal 50% less, but we'll have 3 aimable charges that use 1 ammo. Then for the Buffie, Made with Love will no longer require an ammo to use, but will no longer deal damage. Overcooked now deals 50% more damage total, and lasts 50% longer. Let Out Some Steam no longer uses any heat, and the more heat Pearl has stored, the quicker he'll recover it up to 33% faster. Heat Shield now increases Pearl's attack strength by 10% while active. Pearl's Hypercharge will now pull enemies into its center and deal fire damage over time. For the twins, I started off by giving Larry and Laurie invulnerability while dashing. Then they get a rework, so Larry's weapon will now have a super shell every 3rd attack that will deal more damage in a 50% wider area. This shell will then slow enemies for 2 seconds if you have the Buffie. Laurie now only takes 20% of the damage transferred to him. Protocol Assist now grants both twins a 5% damage buff on subsequent hits. While hypercharged, Larry and Laurie will now both have the super and ability to spawn more twins. Their supercharge rate is also increased by 33% while hypercharged. Steady in Flight will now lifesteal 15% of the damage it deals. Master Fletcher will now have a 33% shorter cooldown. Angelo will now heal 33% more while inside the super area. Angelo now charges his super 25% faster while over to water. Angelo's super will not end while he's hypercharged. Attacks will also charge 20% quicker. Friendship is Great now heals twice as much and will slow nearby enemies for half a second. Rework. Barry's next attack will now have a 100% larger area. Then for the Buffie, this puddle will do 30% more damage and 40% more healing. Rework. Healing from Barry's main attack will now stack at 50% per puddle. Then for the Buffie, if standing on top of a puddle as it despawns, they'll gain an additional 280 health a second for 3 seconds. Barry grants his allies a 15% reload speed buff while on his puddles. While on Barry's ice cream, him and allies will gain a 50% supercharge rate buff while hypercharged. Long Arms will now slow enemies for 1 second. Jump Scare will now scare enemies caught in it, causing them to retreat. Shade can now leech speed from enemies, allowing him to go up to 50% faster while slowing them. Hardened Hoodie now adds the damage he takes to critical hit zones. While hypercharged, Shade will convert all damage dealt and half of the damage he takes into an overshield. Rage Quit will now send a shockwave out from underneath Meeple, where he breaks the rules and will now float above all enemies. Meeple will be able to move, but not attack for 1 second. Mansions of Meeple will now have one wall that Meeple and allies can shoot through. This wall will rotate each second. While in critical success, if Meeple's health hits 0, he'll wait for other brawlers to notice and will become immune to all damage and healing for 1 second. Once the immunity ends, Meeple is defeated and his respawn time will be cut by 1 second. Do Not Pass Go will now grant projectiles an additional 20% flight speed for each wall they pass. Meeple somehow rolled a 22 on a d20, and this gives him access to both gadgets, star powers, and all 6 gears while standing on his hypercharged critical success area. The cooldowns will activate after hypercharge ends though. If Trunk is on top of ants, then the healing from the gadget will be increased by 50%. Trunk will launch ants in a large area around him that deal damage over time. Trunk's ants now slow enemies. They also linger on the ground for an additional 3 seconds. Ants also reduce the reload speed of enemies by 15%. If Trunk makes it to the ants before they despawn, then they'll pick up the stolen ammo. Everywhere Trunk goes now leaves a trail of ants, plus the ants will slow enemies. Mina's Windmill now slows projectiles by 70% rather than stopping them entirely. Then for the Buffie, the Windmill will now also slow enemies and prevent them from reloading while dealing damage over time. Capo What now makes Mina's next super deal 50% more damage. Zum 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 now gives Mina a 15% speed boost for 3 seconds after landing her 3rd combo attack. Mina's super now causes enemies to stumble around for 3 seconds, decreasing their control and slowing them down. Mina skips her first combo attack for the entirety of her hypercharge duration. For Janet, I started off with a rework to her base kit, but making the star power vocal warm-up a part of it. This will just make her less reliant on that ability so the other star power could actually be used. Then, Janet's speaker will now only lose its health while an enemy is actively taking damage to it. Backstage Pass will now increase in cooldown duration, however it will now knock back enemies caught by it. Then, for the Buffie, Backstage Pass can now slow enemies for 1.5 seconds. While flying, Janet can now heal and reload at 75% efficiency. Rework. Janet can now focus her attack for up to 20% more range. The longer you focus, the quicker the projectile as well. So second hits will allow you to charge this up even faster. Then for the Buffie, fully focused attacks will deal up to 15% more damage. Janet's attacks gain the ability to pierce walls and will have a 24% lifesteal that charges as an overshield. For Melody, I started off by giving Interlude to Buffie, so the shield now decay into Melody's health. Perfect Pitch will instantly grant Melody a 4th note that deals equal damage to the other ones. Melody's notes gain 6% speed and damage for each note orbiting her. When Melody's notes vanish, she'll heal 500 health from each note. Melody can now have infinite notes will hypercharge, and hit an enemy will reset the duration of all notes, including hypercharged ones. All Eyes on Me will now no longer require an MO to use. All Eyes on Me now covers a 50% larger area and will steal an additional 15% of opponent's max health. Regulate now steals 1500 health from each opponent it hits. 66% of this will go to Ollie as an overshield. If Ollie attacks into a wall while moving, he'll be able to clear right over it. However, this ability will have a 3-second cooldown. Renegade's shield now decays directly into Ollie's health, healing him for 3000 health over time. While hypercharged, Ollie switches up his music, enabling his super to jump over walls, and if his attacks land, they'll taunt enemies for a quarter of a second. All friendlies and Globert recover an ammo. Effect now lasts for 3 seconds, and the beam can't be detached during this time. Globert's attack or healing now deals impact damage at 2 times the rate per second. While attached to an ally, Globert will gain a 20% shield. When attached to a foe, Globert will charge his super from enemy attacks. While hypercharged, Globert can have a beam on every ally and enemy. They last for 4 seconds after the hypercharge ends, before reverting to Globert's 2 newest links, 1 ally and 1 enemy. Rework. Now You See Me will now act as a separate ability that does not consume ammo. Then for the Buffie, Ziggy will reload all ammo after teleporting. Rework. Electric Shuffle can now charge Ziggy's super. Then for the Buffie, Electric Shuffle now have double the strikes, but they'll be in random locations, somewhat close to enemies. The Great Ziggy will now cause Ziggy's next attack to land 18% quicker as well. Rework. Enemies caught in Ziggy's storm for 3 seconds will now get struck by lightning, becoming stunned for 1 second. Then for the Buffie, stunned enemies will drop 75% of their ammo. The Grand Vortex will now move 50% faster and move towards enemies. Its duration or lifetime though is the same. Then, if Ziggy attacks in the storm radius, it will attack 75% quicker. Out of Line now gives RT a 15% speed boost for 3 seconds. Enemies below 60% health are now grounded by hacks for 1 second. When splitting, RT and his legs will gain a 3000 health decaying shield for 4 seconds. The longer an enemy is marked by RT, the more damage they'll take. Marks will turn gold when fully charged. RT's attacks will now leave marks on the ground that orbit their landing point, dealing 980 damage over time and marking enemies. Weakened Warrior now grants Jaeyeon a 50% reload speed buff for 5 seconds. Time for a Slow Song now knocks back enemies and deals 500 damage. The Crowd Goes Mild now grants Jaeyeon a 10% projectile speed increase. Allies who are on Jaeyeon's speed boost will also get this effect. Extra High Note now also grants projectiles an additional 25% max range for each target hit. Jaeyeon's attacks will now have both effects while his hypercharge is active. This allows him to give speed boosts and heals to himself and allies. Support from Beyond can now be aimed and thrown over walls. Then for the Buffie, Tara will now spawn 3 stronger shadows that have to be defeated to despawn. Physic Enhancer now weakens over time. After 4 seconds, it shrinks, granting Tara a 150% larger sight area in bushes for 4 more seconds. Black Portal now summons 1 additional shadowy version of Tara for each enemy it hits. Healing Shade is now 50% stronger for each brawler Tara super hits, at a 200% cap. While hypercharged, Tara gains the ability to summon a shadow each time she defeats an enemy. Vengeful Spirits now slow enemies for 1 second. Lamp Blowout will now knock back enemies in a 50% larger radius. Health Healed will now charge as Decaying Shield before healing Jean. Magic Puffs now gives Jean and allies a 10% speed boost for 1 second after healing. Spirit Slap now steals 1 ammo from opposing brawlers. Jean's attacks will now boomerang back while hypercharged. Only projectiles that don't land will return. Ice Block will now heal Lou for all damage he takes while invulnerable. Cyber Syrup will now charge 20% of loose super for each opponent it freezes. Opponents in loose super area will now charge their super 33% slower. Loose super area will charge loose super back 50% faster. Hyperthermia will now slow enemies depending on how frozen they are, up to 20%. Loose attacks slow enemies for half a second, and they'll charge Brain Freeze 33% faster. Each of Byron's booster shots will now deal full damage and or healing. Shot in the arm now gives Byron a 15% speed buff for the duration of its effect. Injection will now slow enemies caught by it for half a second. Malaise now reduces enemy supercharge rate by 50% for 3 seconds. Byron's attacks now have a splash effect. This allows him to heal from his own attacks while hypercharged. Air support now leaves burning areas on the ground that deal 480 damage over time. Ruff's sandbags from Take Cover are now immune to all damage for 2 seconds. Air superiority will now activate Ruff's super 50% quicker and over a 15% larger area. Field promotion will now scale with the health of the ally, 25 to 50 health gain a second. Ruff and allies will also gain a 15% speed boost while in the area. Ruff gains a third projectile and his attacks become super bouncy while hypercharged. No Escape now lasts 50% longer, and enemies can now take damage, but at 20% the normal rate. Back to the Finkster now heals or damages Finks for 50% of his health gained or lost over the last 3 seconds. Hieroglyph Halt now reduces the enemy supercharge rate by 25% for 3 seconds. Primer will now increase the damage of Finks' next attack if he lands consecutive shots, for up to plus 25% damage. Finks must be in his super area for this bonus to take effect. While hypercharged, Finks projectiles also warp time around them, slowing nearby projectiles by 70%. Their slowing area will linger behind them for half a second. Enemies caught by Lumi's Grim and Frostbitten will now be grounded if they stay there for over 1.5 seconds. Hit the Lights now have a 3-second effect duration. Then for the Buffy, Hit the Lights now leave a trail of fire behind her attacks, and Lumi if she still has an MO. 42% burnt now deals an additional 560 damage over time to enemies caught on fire. The burn duration is 4 seconds. Halftime will now ground enemies for 1 second that are hit by all 3 of Lumi's attacks. Lumi gains infinite Good Morning Stars while hypercharged. To recall them, she'll hold her attack button. All stars will recall at the end of the hypercharge duration. Utility Belt now gives Buster and allies an 8% speed buff for each ally in a supercharge radius. This speed boost lasts 3 seconds. Slow-mo replay now slows enemies pulled by Buster for 1 second. Blockbuster will now give ammo back to Buster for each ally he has in the supercharge radius. While Montage is active, 20% of all damage that hits the shield, Buster will gain as overshield. Buster's attacks will now block enemy projectiles, and Montage will now knock back enemies that are too close to it while active. Wind Up will now affect all of Squeak's attacks for 2 seconds. Residue now also deals 100 damage a second for 6 seconds to enemies caught in its explosion. Squeak's Blooms now detonate 15% faster for each opponent in their radius. Super Sticky now leaves sticky areas of residue on the ground. These areas last for 2 seconds and have the same size as the explosion. While hypercharged, Squeak's attacks will become super bouncy, traveling 50% further for each bounce. Max will now also regain lost ammo from Sneaky Sneakers, but she can only retain spent ammo from this for 3 seconds. Phase Shifter now reloads all of Max's ammo while dashing. The faster Max moves, the faster she reloads. The faster Max moves, the faster her supercharges. The faster Max moves, the more she heals. She'll now gain 100 to 300 health a second while moving. Transplanting Sprout's Hedge will now also charge with hypercharge at 50% rates. Garden Mulcher will now instantly trigger Sprout's passive regeneration. Photosynthesis will now cause Sprout to start healing 50% quicker if he's in a bush. Overgrowth will now slow enemies for half a second. Sprout's attacks will now pull enemies towards its hedge. Sprout's Hedge will now pull enemies towards it. Lily now regains all ammo after throwing her super. Lily can now track enemies and allies while in the Shadow Realm. After teleporting to an enemy, Lily's next attack will heal her for half of the damage dealt. Lily will now passively regen 15% faster if an enemy is in her supercharge radius. Lily's attacks now call on the Shadow Realm, allowing her to slow enemies for half a second and steal their supercharge at 5% in attack. Charlie Spiders no longer lose health over time. Charlie now heals 100% of her total health when personal space is active. Digestive now also reduces the ammo of opponents caught by it by 1.5. Enemies now get grossed out by Slimy, causing them to run away for 1 second. Enemies forget how to reload while running away. The spiders now wait till after Charlie's hypercharge cocoon breaks to spawn. Charlie's attacks will now spawn spiders if a hidden enemy. If Walking Cane pulls an enemy into a wall, they'll take 1200 damage for each obstacle they hit. Grand Piano when I'll ground enemies hit by it for half a second. Fake Injury when I'll grant Gray a 50% shield for 1 second when at full health. New Perspective now causes enemies to skip the time it would have taken them to travel the door's distance, granting them healing, reload, or even supercharge on select brawlers. Gray's attacks become hit scan for the entirety of his hypercharge. Roundhouse Kick now knocks back enemies caught by it. The stun happens once they land. Corn Fu now slows enemies for half a second. For each kernel they step on, there's no cap to the slow duration. While Divine Souls is active, Fang receives a 15% speed boost. Fresh Kicks now has the new Shoe Smell, healing Fang for 15% of the max health of the enemy he defeats. Fang's attacks now leave a trail of popcorn that deals 50% of its normal damage. Extra Mustard now destroys 1 ammo for each opponent hit by it. Double Sausage now also gives allies and Doug 1 ammo back. When Doug revives an ally, they'll get a 15% speed boost for 5 seconds and become immune to damage for half of one. Self-Service now heals Doug at the same rate he'd heal allies, if he heals an ally. Doug's attacks now heal 100% more and in a 50% larger area while he's hypercharged. Reverse Buoy now slows enemies caught by it for 1 second. If Buzz spots an enemy but they leave his area, he'll still track them for an additional 1.5 seconds. Buzz now moves and reloads 8% faster for each brawler in his supercharge radius. Buzz's super will always have a maximum stun duration. Buzz's super will also travel 15% quicker. Buzz unloads the attacks 50% faster while hypercharged. Each hit will reload 0.1 ammo. Porter Reinforcements will now spawn double the porters. Service Bell will now fully heal all porters it buffs. Revolving Door now grants porters a 15% movement speed buff. Handle with Care will now also cause overstuffed suitcases to explode in a 50% larger area. Mr. P's porters no longer decay in health, and every third attack will spawn an additional porter where it lands. Dodgy Digging now gives Mo a 15% reload speed buff for 5 seconds. Rat Race now adds 1 second and its equivalent ammo to Mo's drill. Speeding Ticket now makes Mo's drill dash twice as fast while underground. Skipping Stones now cause the main projectiles to bounce off enemies, causing the stones to bounce towards them. If Mo's drill hits a wall, he'll break it, and walls now shatter, dealing 1500 damage a projectile to enemies hit. 8 projectiles from each broken wall. Chuck can no longer be hit by projectiles while his next super is active. Chuck can now choose which post to remove, and he'll gain a 15% speed buff for 2 seconds. Tickets Please now gives Chuck an overshield of 1200 health for each enemy he hits. Pit Stop now allows Chuck to have infinite super pegs, but he can only travel through 5 at a time. Chuck can now pick up allies to stops, and he heals them for 1000 health a second while they travel with him. Fat Splatter will now slow enemies caught by it for 1 second. The longer Dormant Stars on the ground, the more damage it deals, up to an additional 200% over 30 seconds. Stencil Glue will now slow enemies' reload speed as well. Every 8th hit, Otis will fire a 5th projectile on his next attack. Otis's projectiles fire in much quicker succession, and he'll reload 50% faster while hypercharged. For Clancy, I started off with a much needed rework. Now after he reaches gold stage, for every 8 extra tokens he earns, he'll send out a small tidal wave around him that will deal 1500 damage and slow enemies. Clancy will now lose 20% of his tokens when he dies, but to level up he will require 20% less tokens. Clancy gains a 15% movement speed buff for 3 seconds. Clancy's attacks now lifesteal for 10% of the damage they deal. When defeating an enemy, Clancy will instantly gain 2 tokens. Clancy also starts the match with 20% of his supercharged. Clancy's main attacks will now return to him, piercing enemies and going through walls on their way back. Dive will now heal 15% of Willow's max health. Willow will now also become susceptible to ally healing when Dive is active. Spellbound now deals an additional 300 damage instantly if it will defeat an enemy. Otherwise, it will deal this damage over time. Love is Blind reduces all healing enemies receive by 30% for 3 seconds. Next enemies will gain 33% health as an overshield while mind controlled by Willow. Willow's super will now drain an enemy at 50% of their max health once it ends. If an enemy were to die, they'll just drop to 1200 health. Elementalist buffs now last 50% longer. Voodoo Chili will now recharge 3 seconds sooner, and its buffs are 30% stronger. Gregory's projectiles now travel 30% faster, and each hit will give Juju a 15% speed boost for 1 second. While Gregory is active, Juju will gain a 40% damage reduction. While hypercharged, Juju's attacks will carry the traits of the last 2 elements she's been on. Presto will now give Miko a 15% speed buff for 2 seconds. Clipping Scream will now ground enemies above 70% health. Monkey Business will now no longer steal ammo, but still gain Miko 1 ammo if he hits an enemy. Then for the Buffie, Miko will now gain an additional 33% reload speed and 20% damage for each enemy Monkey Business hits. One enemy to hit does not increase these stats. If not aimed at an enemy, Miko will be able to jump 30% further. Then for the Buffie, every third attack on a non-brawler, Miko will stun them for 3 seconds and deal an additional 50% damage. Miko's Hypercharge now pauses while Super is active, and if 2 enemies are in one spot, Miko will bounce off of them, dealing an additional 50% damage. Gotta Go will now knock back enemies in the opposite direction Eve is moving. Motherly Love will now temporarily give Eve the healing trait, helping her to charge back her Super and Hypercharge. Hitting enemies will now decrease the cooldown of this ability. Each egg hit will shave off 0.3 seconds. Every 6 hits, Eve's next attack will fire a 4th, stronger egg. Every attack will now spawn a weak hatchling while Eve is hypercharged. If Allie leaps before dashing, the cooldown between attacks will now be decreased by 75%. But if she does not leap before she dashes, her attack cooldown will be increased by 25%. Allie becomes enraged for the next 4 seconds. While this is active, she will charge her super 50% faster. Feed the Gators will now charge an overshield at 130% the normal healing rate if it goes over Allie's max health. Allie now automatically charges her super from nearby enemies while she's enraged. If Allie attacks but doesn't hit anyone, her passive regeneration will no longer stop. Allie is now enraged for the entirety of her hypercharge. Allie will also gain a 25% movement speed buff for 3 seconds from defeating enemies. Gigi charges her super 15% faster while Longer Strains is active. Gigi and allies move 15% faster while in Disappearing Axe area. If Gigi's super is already charged, Gigi will move 15% faster after not receiving damage for 3 seconds. If Helping Hand overheals Gigi, she'll get it as an overshield. Gigi's attack is now always at the max unload rate while her hypercharge is active. Defense Booster now sends out a shockwave that will knock back enemies each time Crow takes damage. Slowing Toxins now radiate off of their target, slowing enemies in a nearby radius. Carry On Crow now charges Crow's super and hypercharge 40% quicker when his attack or super hits targets with 50% or less health. Extra Toxic now reduces enemies' reload speed, granting Crow extra from damaging them. While hypercharged, Crow's dagger's poison effect will now be able to stack, plus all daggers that do not hit a target will return to Crow. For Chester, I started off by making it so all perks will last for 2 more seconds, and Chester will now gain 2 perks at once. There will also be some new perks in the mix: Slowing Shots, Supercharge buff, and Poison attacks. When re-rolling a super, Chester now gains a 50% supercharge rate buff for 2 seconds. Sneak Peek now allows Chester to stack up to 1.5 supers. Single Bella Mania now grants Chester a 15% speed buff for 2 seconds after landing his first sequence attack. While hypercharged, Chester's attacks will now take 2 ammo, but he'll fire his next 3 shots at once. Pierce's shield will now slow enemies that were knocked back for half a second. Pierce's next shot will now also be charged no matter what. When collecting a shell, Pierce will now heal 15% of his max health. Pierce's last bullet will now drop 2 shells if he hits an enemy in the first half of his range. While hypercharged, even missed attacks will now spawn a shell, and attacks that land will spawn double. Dancing Flames will now leave burning areas on the ground that will burn 50% of enemy ammo over 5 seconds. Firestarters now grants Amber a dash, where she reloads 33% of her ammo on use. While near a puddle, Amber can reload an additional ammo up to 150% from normal capacity. Amber now moves 12% faster if on a puddle. Enemies will become slowed by 10%. Amber's attacks now light enemies on fire, dealing an additional 30% damage over 5 seconds. Uppercut now grounds enemies caught by it for half a second. Enemies will take additional damage when they hit the ground. While Last Stand is active and Draco's at 1 health, all healing he receives is increased by 50%, and he moves 33% faster. Shredding will now give Draco an overshield if the healing passes full health. All healing past full health will be increased by 33%. The shield will decay after 4 seconds. Expose now takes effect before damage calculations, making Draco's attack deal the 35% increased damage. Exposed enemies also charge ally supers 25% faster. Draco can now use Lance Stab and Dragon Soul at the same time. Ammo for both attacks are charged separately. Cheeseburger will now heal based off how hungry Kid is. Then for the nerfy, Cheeseburger will now give Kit a shield that drains his health over time. Cardboard box will no longer charge super. Kit will gain a 40% chance to get stuck in the box, revealing his location to enemies and preventing him from attacking. Then for the nerfy, after using cardboard box, Kit becomes unable to charge his super for the duration of the match. Kit is now allergic to power cubes. Kit will now lose 1,000 health when picking up a cube rather than dying. Then, for the nerfy, when Kit has a power cube, he gains a 10% chance to get a hairball and spit it out, dealing another 1,000 damage to Kit. When Kit attaches to an enemy, they have a 50% chance to be deathly allergic. Then for the nerfy, Kit will have a 33% chance for allergy medicine, but he'll give it to someone on the wrong team, making them immune to Kit's attacks for 3 seconds. While hypercharged, Kit's attacks will now damage himself. While asleep, Sandy will also heal allies at 50% of their missing health over 1.5 seconds as long as they're within 2 tiles. Sweet Dreams will now put enemies to sleep and keep them that way even if they take damage. Rude Sands now slows enemies by 15% while they're in Sandstorm's area. Allies will now get a 15% speed boost while in Sandstorm's area if Healing Winds is active. While hypercharged, Sandy's attacks will now cover a 360-degree area, traveling in a clockwise direction. Sandy's attacks will also travel significantly faster while hypercharged. Lollipop Drop can now be activated while Leon is invisible, and it will not cancel the super. Lollipop Drop will also grant Leon and allies a Sugar Rush, granting them a 15% movement speed buff. If enemies take down Leon's clone, then he'll turn invisible for 3 seconds. If Leon's clone decays, it'll charge 35% of his super instantly. Smoke Trails now grants Leon a 30% reload speed buff while invisible. If Leon attacks while invisible, that attack will do full damage no matter what. Invisi-Heal now gives Leon a 60% shield while super is active, as long as he's below 40% health. Leon's attacks now fade in and out of sight while his hypercharge is active, and Leon's attacks will lose damage 75% slower. For Cordelius, I started off by reworking his attack to now do more damage at max range and less at close range. Replanting will now knock back enemies, and Cordelius will reload 50% of his missing ammo. Poison Mushroom will now only mute enemies for the whole second if at max range. It will no longer fire an attack or require an ammo, and it can be aimed. Then for the Buffy, Poison Mushroom will now slow enemies for 1 second. Every third attack where Cordelius hits both projectiles, he'll slow enemies for half a second. Mushrooms spawned from Mushroom Kingdom now linger outside of the Shadow Realm for 8 seconds. Cordelius' attacks will now poison enemies, reducing their healing by 70% and dealing 480 damage over 3 seconds. Power Shield will now absorb 75% of the next attack rather than hit. While Power Surge is active, Surge will gain a 15% movement speed buff. If Surge reaches stage 3 or above before dying, he'll now respawn in stage 1 with an additional half of his supercharged. After reaching stage 3, Surge's attacks now explode on walls, dealing area damage to nearby enemies before splitting. Stage 4? Surge will now keep the increased range from his 5th stage after his hypercharge ends. Hosamaki Healing will now also affect Kenji's ammo if it's a positive increase. Dashy Dash now causes Kenji's first dash to travel 100% the normal distance. While Naguri Nemesis is active, Kenji will move 15% faster. Kenji's Slashimi will now slow enemies for 1 second. Each of Kenji's attacks now dash and slash while his hypercharge is active, but each attack will use 1.5 ammo. It's time to rework Meg. Meg will no longer spawn her mech, but charge her super automatically. Each projectile will now deal 40 more damage. Meg's mech can no longer passively heal, but be healed from other sources. Meg's range inside her mech will also be increased to 8 tiles. Toolbox will now buff reload speed, movement speed, and supercharge rate by 35%, while Meg or allies are in its area. Jolting Volts will now trigger passive regeneration on Meg's mech. Then for the Buffy, it will then also heal an additional 500 health a second for 5 seconds. When destroyed, Meg's mech will blow up, dealing massive damage. It will now scale with the health of an enemy from 30 to 80%. For the Buffy, Mecha's explosion will stun enemies for 1 second and leave a burn area that deals damage over time. While outside of her mech, Meg will gain a permanent 25% shield. Then for the Buffy, Force Field will now knock back enemies when Meg falls below 30% health. Meg's mech will now have infinite ammo while her hypercharge is active. Meg will instantly charge her super outside the mech. Meg can also exit her mech early by tapping the hypercharge button. Kaze also gets a 33% reload speed buff for 2 seconds. Hensou Jutsu will also give Kaze a 30% lifesteal buff for 3 seconds. Kaze instantly recovers 1.5 ammo after dashing, or if she was in bushes, Kaze's invisibility duration will not be reduced. Kaze's gadget cooldown is reduced by 1 second, and Kaze's Fan Storm can now leech opponent's supercharge at a rate of 5% a second. If an enemy is slowed 3 subsequent times by Kaze, her next attack will now ground them for half a second. Kaze's marks now always explode, and the explosion radius is 50% larger. While hypercharged, all of Kaze's attacks will deal maximum damage or be fully critical hit zone. Thanks for watching.